can't I just be cold and heartless like other guys? Why must I feel?
So for anyone who doesn't know what a thembo, commonly himbo, is, it's defined on Urban Dictionary as a large, broad, tall, or buff, attractive person who tends to not be very bright, but usually extremely nice and respectful. They use Kronk as an example, which is perfect because I just watched Kronk's new groove the other day, and that's what gave me this idea. I think not being bright is vague in definition, and can mean anything from being not very book smart, or having no common sense, or being like me and succeeding in having neither. Either way, thembos can vary in nature, and since himbo's origins, the definition has only become more positive and more inclusive. The original himbos were laden with negative interpretations of masculinity. I turned to the modern criticism-turned-meme Chad, who is more interchangeable with the original himbos than anything else I can think of. What we notice, however, is that what used to be painted in a negative light has been reclaimed and reinterpreted as a far more positive trope. I feel compelled to tell you that I graduated with a minor in women's gender and sexuality studies, which means two things. One, most people hate me immediately upon hearing this, and two, I feel a bit more valid in whining about the influence that media has on children's interpretations of gender. In the case of thembos, primarily himbos, I think this trope has the power to positively empower young kids, especially boys. Let's start with the thembo requirement, tends to not be very bright. I think the way media used to view brightness was in a binary manner. You're either bright or you're not. I hate to use this example because it feels very silly, but it helps me with this. The Ninja Turtles. Donatello has books and tech smarts. Leonardo has strategy smarts. Michelangelo has no smarts. And Raphael, yeah, he's there. You can boil this down to D&D stats if you want. Michelangelo would be the closest to a himbo because he has low intelligence and wisdom, but high charisma. I think this interpretation of either bright or not bright has changed, the concept of bright becoming more inclusive, which I think is good. Kids used to be taught via media that if you didn't get straight A+ on your tests, then you're not smart. But now I think a lot of shows demonstrate that most people excel in individual fields, are clever in their own ways. This teaches children not to value themselves by one definition of smart, one definition of brightness. Because if there was only one way to value individuals, that would be a pretty boring world, wouldn't it? So how does this relate to thembos? The origins of himbos were a brand of not book smart that implied they were not good at anything at all. Now with the new phrase having two, one, or no brain cells, the idea is much more memey and instead embodies an energy rather than implying that not being book smart means not being smart at all. In fact, current thembos can be book smart and still have dumbass energy. I guess you could consider Cyborg from Teen Titans a modern, kind of not completely himbo. The dude is great with tech and strategy. He's a genius, but he still has a dumbass energy about him. Or take Kristoff from Frozen. The guy is a survivalist and knows a lot within his field of interest, but he's also a dunce when it comes to interacting with Anna. In other words, it's his energy. I think this newer, more inclusive definition of dumbass energy is good because it doesn't teach intelligence to children in a binary fashion, doesn't leave them to feel as though if you aren't the quote-unquote smart one, then you can't have your own things you excel at. If this feels like I'm reading too much into it, it's probably because I am. So if we move to the part of the thembo definition that reads attractive person, I'm going to be touching on more serious issues in media that stretch beyond this particular trope. TLDR, the common model for conventionally attractive was, and still is, like the roster for The Bachelor or The Bachelorette. Need I say more? Obviously, this is an extremely biased idea of what's attractive, perpetuated by the people in power and in charge of these medias, which is also a product of systemic issues. So yeah, thembos are just one small sprinkle on the whitewashed, body-shaming, heteronormative cake we call media, but my hope is that the current thembos in media are demonstrating a less biased interpretation of this. I mean, a little less biased, maybe? And why would this be good influence on kids who are watching these medias? I think that's self-explanatory. Kids don't just need representation, they need to see other identities that they may not prescribe to in media, and this needs to start happening more quickly and better than it currently is. Yes, those Netflix cartoons are doing it, but we need to see it on a larger scale, and I don't just mean Disney popping in one gay character for a minute and then patting themselves on the back for ending homophobia. Now we shift to large, broad, tall, or buff. I also think this part of the thembo definition has become more liquid over time. Let's take She-Ra, for example, because I'm still on that kick from the show and I want to squeeze out what I can before it fades. Adora is a herbo. I'm not taking constructive criticism on this.
Quicksand! That is now on our list of things to avoid. Wow, we're learning so much today.
While she's not quite large or tall or broad when she's not in her She-Ra form, she's a jock, and presents as such. Once again, it comes back to the concept of energy that today's teens like to toss around. Adora has jock energy, and combined with her dumbass energy and friendly disposition, this makes her a herbo. I think ND Stevenson, whether she knows it or not, has a thing for thembos, because she definitely doesn't have a shortage of them on her show. Okay, let's look at usually extremely nice and respectful. This has 100% been the biggest shift in the trope, one that I think has potential to shift newer generations' interpretations of gender. Older himbos didn't necessarily have to be nice. They could, and often were very nice, but the stress was often given to them being a giant individual who isn't very bright. Newer thembos are much more flexible in these manners, but are almost always people you'd want to be friends with. Let's go back to Kronk, who was my generation's first encounter with what would be considered the modern himbo. He's big, has a deep voice, and was a henchman. This creates a funny juxtaposition with the sweet and respectful nature of his character. While the trope has been played out for a while, the humor still originates from the notion that a big, tall, buff person is expected to be intimidating, but instead the writer pulls the rug out from under you and the character acts gentle. In Kronk's own movie, all he wants is his father's approval, which requires he fulfills his dad's wishes and has a wife and kids and a big house on the hill. He ends up being able to achieve these things for the most part, having a big house and a girlfriend, but he forfeits them for the sake of others. He gives his big house to the seniors who need a place to live, and his girlfriend breaks it off with him when he takes the blame for his camper pulling a mean prank. Kronk demonstrates that he places his integrity, kindness, and own morals above pleasing his father, which, damn, is that slapping the fuck out of the toxic masculinity perpetuated by the patriarchy at a young age. Like, not to be a snowflake on Maine, but so many guys I know have confided in me that they wish they didn't feel such strong societal pushes to ignore their emotions, not cry, act manly, and push away relationships. Kronk shits on all of that, and I think more guys should. Boys and men deserve to feel affection and demonstrate their own soft natures. It's the least they deserve, and I think the Kronk model is doing a great job in this case. So now that we've broken down the definition and hinted at why this trope is healthy, let's go through some examples. Barley from Onward is a total himbo. He's big and tall, but he has a warm heart and acts goofy. He's brilliant in terms of adventure and knowledge, but has some sort of dumbass energy about him. However, above all else, he's caring and is 100% open with his emotions around his brother. I think his himbo character functions as a way of normalizing healthy sibling relationships, especially between brothers. I can't say much on a personal note with this, I only have a brother and I'm a girl, but from what I've seen, and especially from what is broadcasted on media, it's been normalized for brother-brother relationships to be rather competitive. Two men can't share their emotions with each other. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking of two guys from Rocket Power, and then I think from Foster's Home. Like, I can't even remember the names of these characters, but I know they weren't exactly close relationships. Normally, the older brother is even the one to instill this behavior, demonstrating that it's often the case that these behaviors are passed down. They're taught. Barley, however, reverses this trope and is the one to try to get his younger brother to open up. He wants to be friends, share things, and have open communication with his brother despite his unique interests. This played out wonderfully throughout the movie. When Ian started checking off his list of things he wanted to do with his dad, and then realized that it was his brother who raised him, I cried like a baby. Barley's himbo persona was what drove this movie, and in turn drove the healthy sibling relationship that so many kids got to watch. Now, I've been shitting on the pre-2000 thembos a lot, but one thing I want to point out is that some strides were tooketh. Let's take He-Man, whose name is the embodiment of masculinity. Obviously, I knew of He-Man, but I didn't actually give the original show a shot until after binging all of the new She-Ra. While the body types are definitely not breaking any boundaries in the 80s, I was surprised to see that right away Adam cooked and wore pink. I know this is a low bar, but seeing two things I can only assume were even more gendered in the 80s than they are now, and to see the embodiment of masculinity enjoying them, it was actually pretty nice. I do think He-Man is still closer to an older himbo than a newer one, but he did his work, and I respect that. Now, himbos are used on a much larger scale, even if they aren't given the title. Thor. If you like Thor, you like a himbo. I'm not going too into detail with this one because 1, I haven't watched these movies in a while, and 2, I'm very afraid of Marvel stans. But he's this giant god who's got some giant-ass hammer and has millions of fans from young boys to adult men. but he's also a sweetheart with one brain cell. What this does is slowly bring up and normalize this trope to the very people who may be afraid of it, may have been told in their lives that these kinds of characters are over-feminized and therefore bad. I don't know much about Marvel, but I've actually been told that in general the lessons are misconstrued by audiences a lot and often paraded around as examples of the very ideas they're meant to deconstruct. So to sum up, thembos have shifted from their original definition into characters who portray openness and caring dispositions. While yes, this is good for all kids watching, I do think it's best for the young boys in the audiences who probably need reassurance that it's okay to show emotion and care and respect yourself. If people argue that media doesn't influence kids like this, then they probably didn't watch Avatar: The Last Airbender. Everyone I know who watched this show ended up using the lessons they learned to guide themselves at least once in their lives. I can't think of a perfect thembo example in the show, but Sokka definitely parallels it at the very least. He starts off misogynistic and has a complex originating from his dad leaving, and through experiencing the world around him and meeting new people, he's open to change. He learns to be honest with his emotions, allow himself to be weak at times, and care for the people around him. It's wild now with everyone watching Avatar again in 2020, Sokka has come up as the resident favorite, and I really like that. He's the embodiment of taking healthy lessons and transforming it into change, and I love knowing that he's a character so many people get to experience now, and I know it will follow them into their own lives. So yes, maybe I just love thembos. Yes, maybe I'm scraping too hard for this just because I want to rant about cartoons and movies, but god damn it, I really think that this trope is putting good into the world, and I really hope to see more of it.